The wind was a thief in that high country, stealing the warmth from the sun and the sound from the air. It was a lonely place, a place for men who had lost their taste for the world below. Silas was such a man. His beard was a thicket of gray and black, his eyes the color of a winter sky, and his hands were hard from the axe and the knife. He was on his way back from the lower woods, a rare trip to trade a few perfect pelts for salt, flour, and quiet. He walked the old trapper's path, a line known more by memory than by sight. It was then he saw it, a pale slash of white against the dark trunks of the pines. It was wrong. White was the color of settlement, of surrender. It did not belong here. He stopped, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. He was a creature of caution, every sense honed by solitude. He moved off the path, silent as a hunting cat, circling the intrusion. It was a post, a thick timber, sunk deep into the earth at a forgotten crossroads, and bound to it was a woman. Her dress was white, a wedding dress, now torn at the hem and stained with mud and what looked like blood. Her hair, a cascade of dark auburn, was matted and wild. Her head was bowed, her body limp, but as he drew closer, he saw the subtle rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. He saw the rope, thick and new, cutting into the soft skin of her wrists. He saw the raw, chafed circle around her neck where another rope had been, a cruel mockery of a necklace. Someone had done this. Someone had brought her here, dressed her like a bride for a funeral, and left her for the cold or the wolves. He stepped out from the trees. He made no sound, but she sensed him. Her head lifted slowly, a painful, creaking motion. Her eyes met his. They were not broken. They were filled with a cold, hard fire, a defiance that had outlasted her strength. Her lips, cracked and blue, moved, but no sound came out. Silas did not speak. Words were clumsy things, heavy and often useless. He walked to the post, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods, reading the tracks. 3 horses, men. They had come from the town and the valley. They had left her and ridden away laughing. He could hear the echo of their cruelty in the stillness. He drew his knife. The blade was worn but sharp, an extension of his will. The woman flinched as he raised it, her eyes widening, the fire within her flickering with fear. He did not look at her. He looked at the rope. He placed the blade against the fibers binding her wrists and sliced down. The rope fell away. He did the same for the bonds at her ankles. She slumped forward, her body having no strength left to hold itself upright. He caught her before she hit the ground. She was lighter than he expected, a bundle of cold limbs and fierce will. He lifted her into his arms. Her head lolled against his shoulder, a faint, shuddering breath escaping her lips. It was a sound of surrender, not to him, but to the exhaustion she had fought for so long. He turned his back on the post, on the tracks, on the world of men below. He started the long walk back up the mountain, into the heart of solitude. He did not know her name. He did not know her crime. He only knew that the mountain did not suffer needless cruelty, and neither, he was discovering, did he. The weight in his arms was a strange and unfamiliar burden, but not an unwelcome one. It was the weight of a life. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt like he had a purpose beyond simple survival. The journey to his cabin was a silent pilgrimage. He moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, his legs thick with the muscle of a life lived on an incline. The woman, Elara, though he did not know her name, was a still weight against his chest. Her breathing was shallow, a fragile rhythm against the solid beat of his own heart. He climbed, leaving the sparse pines at the foothills for the dense, ancient firs of the higher slopes. The air grew colder, cleaner. This was his world, a place of stone and wood and sky, governed by seasons, not by sheriffs or suns. The cabin, when it finally appeared through the trees, was much like the man who built it. It was small, sturdy, and unadorned, seeming to grow from the mountain itself. It was made of thick, hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss. A thin curl of gray smoke, the ghost of his morning fire, rose from the stone chimney. It was not a home. It was a shelter, a fortress against the wilderness and the past. He pushed the heavy planked door open with his shoulder and carried her inside. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke, pine, and drying herbs. A single room held his entire existence. A stone hearth where embers still glowed, a rough-hewn table with one chair, a bed built into the wall, piled with furs. He laid her gently on the bed, pulling a heavy bearskin over her. Her skin was like ice. Her lips were a faint, alarming blue. He moved with an economy born of long practice. He stoked the embers in the hearth, adding kindling and then larger logs until a healthy fire crackled, pushing its warmth into the room. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the flames. He found a clean rag, and once the water was warm, he began to clean the grime and dried blood from her face and hands. His touch was surprisingly gentle, the calloused hands that could fell a tree now carefully dabbing at the cuts on her wrists. She stirred, moaning softly, her eyes fluttering open. They were filled with a disoriented fear. She tried to pull away, a flicker of that fierce defiance returning. "Easy," he said. The word was a rough, gravelly thing, pulled from a deep well of silence. It was the first word he had spoken to her. It was enough. She stilled, watching him. Her eyes were a deep, clear green, like moss in a sunlit forest. They took in the cabin, the fire, the furs, and him. She was a cornered animal, assessing a threat. He finished his work, then ladled some warm broth from a pot that had been simmering by the fire. He held the bowl to her lips. She hesitated, her pride warring with her body's desperate need. Finally, she drank. The hot liquid seemed to trace a path of life back into her. He set the empty bowl aside and retreated to the other side of the room. He gave her the fire, the bed, the space. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and began to mend a leather strap from a snowshoe. His hands were busy, but his attention was on her. The silence returned, but it had changed. It was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a space between them, filled with unspoken things. Her pain, his caution, a shared fragile moment of safety in a world that had offered none. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. Inside the small stone and log fortress, a stranger mended a strap, while another stranger began to heal. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the cabin's single small window. The rhythm of Silas's life was simple and unchanging. He rose before the sun, tended the fire, checked his snares, and spent the daylight hours in the endless, quiet labor of survival. He chopped wood, repaired his tools, scraped hides. He moved with a profound lack of hurry, a man in tune with the slow turning of the world. Elara watched him from the bed of furs. For 2 days she did not speak. She ate the food he offered, a simple broth, a piece of roasted rabbit, and drank the herbal tea he brewed, a bitter concoction that nonetheless eased the ache in her bones. Her strength returned in small increments. First, she could sit up on her own. Then she could stand, swaying slightly, using the wall for support. Through it all, he kept his distance. He gave her the illusion of solitude, though she knew his awareness was always on her. He was like the mountain itself, a vast, silent presence that was neither welcoming nor threatening, but simply was. On the 3rd day, she spoke. Her voice was thin but clear. "Why?" She was standing by the fire, her back to him. He was at his table, sharpening a skinning knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone stopped. He did not turn. He thought for a long moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because words were foreign territory. "The wolves would have come," he said finally. It was not a complete answer, but it was an honest one. She seemed to accept it. She turned from the fire. Her wedding dress was ruined, a tattered ghost of what it had been. Silas had left a folded shirt of his own and a pair of worn buckskin trousers at the foot of the bed. She had not touched them. Her pride was a shield, and the ruined dress was part of it, a testament. That afternoon, she took the broom he had made from birch twigs and began to sweep the floor. It was a small act, but it was a reclaiming. She was no longer just a patient, a victim. She was a presence in the room, asserting her existence through a simple domestic task. Silas watched her from the corner of his eye. He said nothing. The next day, she found a needle and thread in a small wooden box and began to mending a tear in one of the blankets. Her stitches were small and even. Her hands, though still bruised, were steady. She was creating order in his stark world. That evening, as he served her a bowl of stew, their hands brushed. It was a fleeting contact, skin against skin. She did not pull away. He did not pull away. It was the first time they had touched without the buffer of injury or necessity. A current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement. Trust, he was learning, was not built with words. It was built with shared silence, with warm stew on a cold night, with the quiet industry of two people finding their place in a room too small for secrets. A late autumn storm rolled in off the peaks, a wild and violent thing that threw itself against the cabin. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the rain came in hard, horizontal sheets that rattled the window and found the tiny, unseen cracks in the chinking. The world outside was erased, replaced by a churning gray chaos. Inside, a fire in the hearth was their anchor, a defiant orange heart against the storm's fury. The forced proximity made the small space feel even smaller. The silence, once a neutral space, was now charged with the energy of the tempest. For 2 days they were prisoners of the weather, moving around each other in their established, quiet ballet. But the storm outside seemed to be churning up a storm inside Elara. On the second night, she cried out in her sleep. Not a loud scream, but a choked, terrified sound, a name half-muttered, half-sobbed. "No? Jed? Please." Silas, who had been dozing in his chair by the dying fire, was instantly awake. He didn't move. He sat in the flickering shadows, watching her. She was thrashing under the furs, her face a mask of fear. He saw the ghosts she was fighting. He saw the men with laughing eyes and cruel hands. His own hands clenched into fists at his side. He had an urge to go to her, to wake her, to offer some kind of comfort. But what comfort could he offer? He was a stranger. His touch might only bring more fear. So he stayed where he was, a silent, grim-faced sentinel, and he kept watch. He added a log to the fire, keeping the shadows at bay until their nightmare passed and she settled into a deeper, calmer sleep. The storm broke just before dawn. When the sun rose, it was into a world washed clean, glittering, and sharp. The tension in the cabin, however, remained. Elara was quiet, her eyes shadowed. She avoided his gaze, ashamed of the vulnerability he had witnessed. He was making coffee, the rich, bitter smell filling the small room. He poured a cup and set it on the table near her. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "His name is Jed Blackwood," she said, her voice low. She didn't look at him. She looked into the fire. "He's the sheriff's son." Silas said nothing, just leaned against the wall, listening. "My father. He owed the sheriff money. A lot of money. He made a deal." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. A daughter for a debt. "I was to marry Jed." She took a sip of the coffee. "I said no. I said I would rather die. Jed, he doesn't like being told no. He and his father, they think they own the valley. They think they own everyone in it." She finally looked at him, her green eyes blazing with that cold fire he had seen at the post. "He said if he couldn't have me, then no one would, so they brought me up here. A bride for the wilderness." Silas's jaw was a hard line. He pushed himself off the wall and walked to the corner where his axe leaned. He picked it up. He ran his thumb over the blade, testing its edge. He didn't need to. He knew its edge. The action was for him. It was a focusing of the cold rage that was building in his chest. He had come to this mountain to escape the savagery of men like Jed Blackwood. And now, it seemed, that savagery had followed him home. The specter of the sheriff and his son lingered in the air for a few days, a foul taste they both tried to ignore. Then, slowly, the rhythm of survival took over again, pushing the fear to the background. The world was shrinking, closing in around the cabin as the first snows began to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the mountain in white. Their life became a study in shared purpose. They were no longer a man and a woman, but a single unit working against the encroaching winter. He taught her things. He showed her how to read the tracks of a snowshoe hare, how to find the dry wood at the heart of a fallen tree. He taught her how to hold a knife to skin a rabbit, his large hand guiding hers, a touch that was purely instructional, yet held a deep, unspoken intimacy. She learned quickly, her hands, once soft, growing capable. She, in turn, brought a subtle order to his life he hadn't realized was missing. She mended the rip in his winter coat, her stitches neat and strong. She organized the dried herbs and roots he kept in a jumble of sacks, arranging them in careful bundles that hung from the rafters. She made the cabin feel less like a hermit's den and more like a bastion. The single room, once stark and empty, began to fill with the small signs of a shared existence. One afternoon, while the snow fell in a thick, silent curtain outside, Silas sat by the fire, a piece of seasoned pine in his hand. He worked with his knife, not with the quick, efficient motions of a man skinning an animal, but with a slow, focused tenderness. Elara watched him, her own mending forgotten in her lap. The wood shavings fell at his feet like soft curls of snow. Over the course of an hour, a shape emerged from the block of wood. It was a bird, a small wren, its head cocked as if listening, its tiny feathers rendered with impossible detail. It was an object of pure, useless beauty. It served no purpose for survival. It would not keep them warm or feed them. When he was finished, he smoothed the last rough edge with his thumb, and without a word, stood up and placed it on the mantelpiece above the fire. He didn't look at her or acknowledge the gift in any way. He simply put on his coat and went outside to chop more wood. Elara walked to the fireplace. She reached out and touched the small wooden bird. It was smooth and warm, still holding the heat from his hands. She ran her finger along the delicate curve of its wing. It was the first gift she had received that was not a chain. It was a message, spoken in the only language he knew. It said, "There is more than just survival." It said, "There can be beauty here." It said, "I see you." She looked out the window at the tall, silent man swinging his axe, his breath pluming in the cold air. And for the first time since she'd been brought to the mountain, she felt the unmistakable, terrifying, and hopeful sensation of being home. The fragile peace of their winter sanctuary was shattered by the sound of a horse. It was a single rider, his approach clumsy, unused to the deep snow. Silas heard him long before he was visible, the unnatural crunch and slide of hooves a violation of the mountain silence. He was outside, splitting logs, the axe a familiar weight in his hands. He stopped, his head cocked, listening. Elara appeared in the doorway of the cabin, her face pale, a question in her eyes. "Inside," he said, his voice low and firm. "Stay away from the window." She vanished without a word, the heavy door closing with a soft thud. Silas set the axe down, leaning it against the woodpile. He did not want a weapon in his hand. Not yet. He stood and waited, a figure of absolute stillness against the backdrop of snow and pine. The rider emerged from the trees, a stout man in a thick wool coat and a sheriff's star pinned crookily to his chest. Deputy Miller. A man whose ambition was larger than his courage. He pulled his horse to a halt a dozen yards away, his eyes taking in the cabin, the smoke from the chimney, the tall, bearded man standing before him. "That's far enough, Miller," Silas called out, his voice carrying easily in the cold, still air. Miller shifted in his saddle, trying for an air of authority that didn't suit him. "Silas, didn't figure you for company." His eyes darted towards the cabin. "Just checking the high country. Heard tell of a stray." Silas didn't move a muscle. His gaze was flat and hard. "No strays up here. Just what belongs." The subtext hung between them, thick as the winter cold. Miller was probing, sent by Blackwood to see if the rumors were true, to see if the girl who had defied the sheriff's son had somehow survived. "Funny thing," Miller pressed, a sneer touching his lips. "Sheriff Blackwood lost something valuable. Promised to his boy, Jed." "Things get lost in the mountains," Silas said, his voice dropping lower. "Sometimes they're better off lost." Miller's horse stamped its foot, sensing the tension. The deputy's hand drifted towards the pistol at his hip, a gesture of nervous bravado. "The sheriff ain't a patient man, Silas. He gets what he's owed. You do well to remember that." Silas took one slow step forward. It was not an aggressive move, but the sheer, deliberate weight of it made Miller flinch. "You can tell Blackwood," Silas said, his voice like the grinding of stones, "that this is my land. The air is my air. The trees are my trees. Anything that lives on this mountain is under my protection. You tell him to stay down in his valley, with his dirt and his greed. There's nothing for him up here." The deputy stared at Silas for a long moment. He saw no fear. He saw no room for negotiation. He saw a man who had drawn a line in the snow, a line he would die to defend. Miller was not a man willing to die for Jed Blackwood's bruised pride. He tugged on his reins, turning his horse in a clumsy circle. "You're a fool, Hermit," he spat, but there was no conviction in it. He spurred his horse and rode away, his retreat as undignified as his arrival. Silas watched until he was gone, swallowed by the trees. The silence returned, but it was a different kind. It was the silence before a storm. The threat was no longer a ghost from the past. It had a name, and now it had a face, and it knew where to find them. The deputy's visit left a scar on their quiet life. The peace they had carefully constructed felt thin, breakable. Elara grew jumpy, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line, her ears straining at every snap of a twig or howl of the wind. The threat was no longer an abstract memory. It was a horseman who now knew the way to their door. Silas, too, was changed. A grim watchfulness settled over him. He spent more time walking the perimeter of his territory, his rifle a constant companion. He was a man preparing for a war he had not sought. The tension between them grew, but it was a tension that bound them closer. They were allies now, their survival inextricably linked. One evening, as she was adding a log to the fire, Elara's hand brushed against something in the dark corner beside the hearth. It was covered by a dusty canvas sheet. Curiosity overriding her caution, she pulled the sheet away. Underneath was a small rocking horse. It was beautifully carved, its lines simple and elegant, but it was coated in a thick layer of dust and draped with cobwebs. It was an object of love they had been left to neglect, a monument to a forgotten joy. She looked over at Silas. He was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. He had seen her, but he did not stop his work. He pretended not to notice the sudden, heavy silence in the room. "Who was it for?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The rhythmic click and scrape of him cleaning the rifle stopped. He set the cleaning rod down carefully. His broad shoulders seemed to sag, just for a moment, under an invisible weight. He stared at the rifle on the table, not at her, not at the horse. "My daughter," he said. The words were stones dragged from the bottom of a deep, cold lake. Lila. It was the first time she had heard him speak a name from his past. It felt like a sacred thing. She and her mother? He stopped, his throat working. There was a fever. Down in the settlement at Willow Creek, 10 years ago. He finally looked up, and his eyes were not the eyes of the stoic mountain man. They were the eyes of a father, a husband, filled with a pain so old and vast it seemed to have no end. I was a builder. I built half that town. Built our house with my own hands. But I couldn't build a wall against a fever. I couldn't stop it. He looked at his hands, the hands that could build and mend and protect, as if they had betrayed him. I buried them both in the same week. Then I came up here. I figured the mountain was a safer place, quieter. Now she understood. She understood the silence, the solitude, the fierce, protective shell he had built around himself. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was hiding from a pain he could not outrun. He had lost a family, and the mountain was his penance. Elara didn't offer empty words of sympathy. She knew they would be useless against a grief so profound. Instead, she turned back to the rocking horse. She found a clean, soft rag and began, very gently, to wipe away the years of dust and neglect, bringing the warmth of the wood back to life. The act of cleaning the rocking horse was a quiet offering. Elara worked with a reverent care, her hands gentle on the worn wood. She wiped away the dust from every curve, every joint, chasing the shadows from the carved mane and tail. It was not her memory, not her grief, but she tended to it as if it were. She was polishing a piece of his soul, a piece he had tried to hide away in the dark. Silas watched her. He did not speak, did not move to help. He simply watched as she brought this piece of his buried life back into the light. When she was finished, the little horse seemed to gleam in the firelight, no longer a dusty relic of pain, but a testament to a love that had once existed. She did not move it. She left it in its corner, but now it was a presence, a part of their shared space. The air in the cabin shifted that night. The revelation of his past, and her silent, respectful acknowledgment of it, had forged something new between them. The last walls of caution and mistrust had crumbled. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were two broken people who understood each other's scars without needing to name them all. They sat by the fire, the storm of the past having finally given way to a deep, quiet calm. The snow fell softly outside the window, muffling the world. Elara looked at him, her gaze direct, unwavering. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a resolute strength. "They will come for me," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. The thaw would come, and with it, the roads would clear. Blackwood and his son would not let the insult stand. "I know," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He looked back at her, his winter sky eyes meeting her forest green ones. The firelight danced in their depths. He saw her strength, her resilience, the unbending core of her that had refused to break, even when she was tied to a post. She was not a victim to be saved. She was a survivor to be fought alongside. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce, it was almost painful. It was for her, for the life they had built in this cabin, for the memory of the family he had failed to protect before. He would not fail again. "Let them," he said. The two words were a vow, an unbreakable promise forged in the heart of the mountain. They were a declaration of war. He was no longer just a hermit hiding from his ghosts. He was a guardian. And she was no longer a woman on the run. She was a woman who had found a place to make her stand. Together, they would face what was coming. The fire crackled, a warm and steady heartbeat in the center of their world. They were ready. The winter broke, as it always did. The iron grip of the frost loosened, and the mountain began to weep, streams of meltwater carving new paths through the snow. The sun felt warmer, the days longer. Green shoots, stubborn and hopeful, pushed their way through the thawing earth. With the promise of spring came the certainty of conflict. Silas and Elara moved with a quiet, shared purpose. They were conserving their resources, but also preparing. Silas spent an afternoon methodically checking and cleaning his rifle and his pistol, the metallic sounds sharp and final in the small cabin. Elara, in turn, gathered stones, stacking them near the window, small, hard projectiles that could be thrown with surprising force. There was little talk of what was to come. It was understood. They were a garrison of 2. The day came on a bright, clear morning. A hawk circled high overhead, its cry a lonely note in the vast blue sky. Silas was splitting the last of the winter wood when he heard it, the distant, unmistakable sound of multiple horses, their progress slow but steady up the thawing mountain path. He straightened up, the axe held loosely in his hand. He looked towards the cabin. Elara stood in the doorway, her face set, her hands holding the spare rifle he had taught her to load. Their eyes met across the clearing. No words were needed. He gave her a single sharp nod, and she disappeared back inside. He left the axe and walked into the cabin, pulling the heavy plank door shut and sliding the thick wooden bar into place. He went to the window, his own rifle in his hand. They came out of the trees like a blight upon the landscape. Sheriff Blackwood was in the lead, his face a mask of smug authority. Beside him rode his son, Jed, a cruel sneer on his face, his eyes fixed on the cabin with a possessive hunger. Behind them were 3 other men, hard-faced riders from the valley, guns holstered at their hips, mercenaries bought for a few dollars and the promise of sport. They pulled up in a semicircle, facing the cabin, their horses stamping nervously in the mud. Silas. Blackwood's voice boomed, falsely jovial. No need for this to get ugly. You've had your fun with my property. Time to give her back. Jed laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. Yeah, Hermit. Send her on out. I got a wedding to finish. Elara, standing in the shadows beside Silas, flinched at the sound of his voice, but her hands on the spare rifle were steady. She's not property, Silas said, his voice low but carrying with deadly clarity through the closed door. And she's not yours. Blackwood's face darkened. I am the law in this valley, and I say she is. I'm giving you one chance. Open that door and send her out, or we're coming in. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute. Silas looked at Elara. He saw the tremor in her hands, but he also saw the fire in her eyes. She was terrified, but she would not break. He felt a swell of pride. He raised his rifle, resting the barrel on the windowsill. He didn't aim at any of the men. He aimed at the thick trunk of a pine tree, just to the left of the sheriff. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a deafening crack that echoed off the mountainside. A chunk of bark exploded from the tree. It was not an attack. It was an answer. The warning shot hung in the air, a declaration that dialogue was over. Blackwood's face contorted with rage. You son of a bitch, he roared. Light him up. The world outside the cabin erupted in gunfire. Bullets slammed into the thick log walls, sending splinters flying. The sound was a deafening, chaotic roar. Inside, Silas and Elara were already moving. They stayed low, away from the window and the door, the small space their only shield. The back, Silas grunted, crawling towards the rear of the cabin where a small, shuttered opening, barely a window, was set high in the wall. They'll try the back. He was right. As the main volley of fire kept them pinned at the front, one of the hired guns crept around the side. Silas pushed the heavy shutter open a crack. The man was there, trying to use a crowbar on the rear door. Silas didn't hesitate. His shot was single, precise. The man cried out and fell, his crowbar clattering on the stones. Yet's voice, high with fury and a touch of panic, screamed from the front. "He got Tom! He got Tom!" The firing intensified, a panicked, angry fusillade that chewed at the wood of the cabin. A bullet punched through the wall and buried itself in a sack of flour, sending a white puff into the air. Silas had moved back to the front window. He fired sparingly, each shot aimed to disable, to disrupt. He wasn't a murderer, but he was a protector. He winged one of the other men, sending him scrambling for cover. Elara, her face pale but determined, was a silent, efficient partner. She reloaded the second rifle, her hands moving with the practiced surety he had taught her. She handed it to him, taking the empty one, her movements economical and calm. They were a well-oiled machine, working in perfect, unspoken sync. The front door groaned under a heavy impact. They were using a log as a battering ram. The thick wooden bar holding it trembled. "Get ready," Silas said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. The door shuddered again, the hinges screaming. On the third impact, the wood around the bar splintered and the door flew open, torn from its moorings. One of Blackwood's men, a big, bearded man, lunged through the opening, a pistol in his hand. He was met not by Silas, but by Elara. She swung the heavy, empty rifle like a club, catching him squarely in the side of the head. He staggered, stunned, his pistol firing into the ceiling. Before he could recover, Silas was on him, disarming him with a brutal efficiency and throwing him back out into the mud. The assault faltered. They had lost one man, another was wounded, and their initial charge had been thrown back. The brutal, violent momentum was broken. Silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded man. The fight was not over, but the first round had gone to the mountain. The lull in the fighting was thick with menace. Outside, Sheriff Blackwood seethed, his simple plan of intimidation shattered against the cabin's walls and the hermit's resolve. Inside, Silas and Elara stood amidst the splinters and dust, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. The broken doorway was a gaping wound, an open invitation. "Stay back," Silas murmured, pushing her gently towards the relative safety of the hearth. He stood in the shadows just inside the doorway, his rifle ready. Jed Blackwood, his face flushed with rage and cowardice, made his move. He didn't charge in. He grabbed the wounded man Silas had shot and shoved him forward as a human shield. "Come on out, girl," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Or I'll put a bullet in this one myself." It was a desperate, pathetic ploy. But before Silas could react, Jed saw his chance. He dropped the wounded man and lunged through the doorway, his eyes wild, fixed on Elara. He wasn't thinking about the hermit. His entire being was focused on the woman who had defied him. "You're mine," he snarled, grabbing for her. Elara didn't scream. She didn't cower. The woman who had mended clothes and swept floors and learned to set snares met his lunge with a fury of her own. She brought her knee up hard into his groin. Jed gasped, his eyes wide with pained surprise, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all she needed. She shoved him back with all her strength, and he stumbled over the body of the man he had used as a shield, falling heavily into the mud outside. At the same time, Sheriff Blackwood, seeing his son go down, finally charged, his own pistol drawn. But Silas was there to meet him. It wasn't a gunfight. Silas slammed the butt of his rifle into Blackwood's wrist. Bones crunched. The pistol fell to the ground. Silas kicked it away. The sheriff stared at his ruined hand in disbelief, all the authority draining from his face, replaced by shock and pain. He was just a man, old and now broken. Silas stood over him, his shadow falling across the two defeated men. Jed was whimpering in the mud. The sheriff was cradling his hand, his face pale. The last remaining hired gun, seeing it was over, was already disappearing back into the trees. Silas looked from the father to the son, his expression one of cold contempt. He leveled the rifle, not at the sheriff, but at Jed. "She is not a thing to claim," he said, the words an echo of what he had told the deputy, but now they were a final judgment. He didn't pull the trigger. Killing them would be an ending, but it would be too easy. Their power didn't come from their own strength, but from the fear they wielded in the valley below. To break that fear, they had to be seen as they were, weak, defeated men. "Get up," Silas said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Take your trash and get off my mountain, and don't ever come back." He watched as the sheriff, cradling his broken hand, and the humiliated Jed helped their wounded man onto a horse and began the long, shameful ride back down to the town they thought they owned. The silence that descended after they left was profound. It was not the tense, watchful silence of before, but a deep, ringing quiet that settled over the mountain like a fresh blanket of snow. The battle was over. The air, still carrying the faint, acrid smell of gunpowder, began to clear. Elara stood in the ruined doorway, her chest heaving, watching the defeated party disappear into the trees. Her hands were trembling now, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. Silas came to stand beside her. He was bleeding from a shallow gash on his forehead, where a splinter had caught him, but he seemed not to notice. He looked not at the retreating men, but at her. He saw the tremor in her hands, and gently he reached out and took one of them in his. His hand was large and warm and steady, enveloping hers completely. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound, grounding solidarity. They had fought together. They had won together. They stood there for a long time, 2 sentinels guarding the entrance to their home. Then the work began. There was no victory celebration, only the quiet, necessary tasks of restoration. They tended to their minor wounds first, cleaning and bandaging them with a practiced gentleness. They buried the man who had died, a grim task performed with a quiet respect for the life that had been lost, no matter which side he had been on. They did not speak of the violence. It was a storm that had passed, leaving damage in its wake that now had to be repaired. Silas, with a craftsman's focus, began to fix the door. He found new, sturdy planks, and with Elara helping to hold them in place, he painstakingly rebuilt their shield against the world. The sounds of his hammer and saw were sounds of healing, of order being restored. Elara, in turn, began to set the cabin to rights. She swept up the splinters and dust, righted the overturned flour sack, and scrubbed the floor clean of mud and blood. She was erasing the violation, reclaiming their space. As the sun began to set, casting long golden fingers of light across the valley, they stood together outside the newly repaired door. The air was cool and clean. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The cabin, once a hermit's refuge, and a fortress under siege, now felt like something else entirely. It was a home, forged in silence, tested by violence, and now sanctified by a shared victory. He looked down at her, at the fierce, resilient woman who had brought chaos and purpose back into his life. She looked up at him, at the quiet, steady man who had shown her that strength was not about noise and power, but about stillness and resolve. He was no longer just the hermit Silas. She was no longer just the survivor Elara. They were a family, born not of blood, but of circumstance and choice. The fire he lit in the hearth at night burned brighter than ever before, a warm, defiant heart in the quiet peace of the mountain. So here ends our story of the hermit and the bride. It is a tale of how 2 broken souls, pushed to the very edge of their endurance, found in each other not just a refuge, but a reason. They discovered that a home is not 4 walls, but the space between 2 people who choose to stand together against the storm. And they learned that the quietest love can often be the strongest, a bond built not on grand declarations, but on shared silence, steady hands, and a simple, unwavering promise to protect what is precious. Before you go, tell me, what is the strongest wall you have ever built? And was it meant to keep the world out, or to keep something precious safely within?